20-year-old man shot to death by police after he tried to kill former President Donald Trump on July 13th had sought information about the assassination of President John Kennedy. That's according to FBI Director Christopher Wray, who testified before Congress Wednesday about the agency's investigation into Thomas Crooks.
On July 6th, he did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy? And so that's a search that obviously is significant in terms of his state of mind. That is the same day that it appears that he registered for the Butler rally.
Wray said Crooks fired at least 8 rounds from his rooftop position, wounding the Republican presidential candidate in the ear at Trump's rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, killing one rally attendee and wounding 2 others. Crooks used an AR-15 assault-style rifle with a collapsible stock.
The first people to observe him with the weapon were when he was already on the roof, and we haven't yet found anybody with firsthand observation of him with the weapon walking around beforehand. So that doesn't mean he wasn't, obviously, but the collapsible stock is potentially a very significant feature that might be relevant.
Wray also said Crooks flew a drone over the site of the rally about 2 hours before the shooting.
For about 11 minutes, from I think it's around 3:50 p.m. to 4 p.m., somewhere in that range, he was flying the drone, and we have the flight path. It's about 200 yards away from where former President Trump would ultimately be speaking.
Police found crude explosive devices in Crooks' car and home, though the FBI believes the suspect would not have been successful had he tried to detonate the devices. In terms of a motive, Wray said investigators are digging hard, but have yet to come up with anything. He described the shooter as a loner and said there was no evidence at this point that anyone else was involved. The hearing was much less confrontational than one Monday, featuring the head of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheadle, who faced bipartisan demands to quit over the failure to prevent the attempted assassination. She resigned a day later.
Streets were quiet in Taiwan on Thursday after a powerful and deadly typhoon swept the island, killing at least 2 people and sinking a freighter offshore whose crew are still missing. Typhoon Gaimi was the strongest cyclone to hit Taiwan in 8 years. The weather authority says the storm made landfall around midnight on the northeastern coast of Yilan, packing gusts of up to 141 miles per hour before weakening. The storm cut power to around 500,000 households in Taiwan, though the local power utility said most of it had been restored by midday Thursday. The government said on top of the 2 people killed in the storm, more than 260 were counted as injured. Gaimi dumped rain across the island, with eyewitness video showing floods in the southern city of Kaohsiung. Fire officials also said a Tanzania-flagged freighter with 9 Myanmar nationals on board had sunk off the city's coast. Authorities said they were searching for the crew, who have not responded to communications. Separately, Philippine officials said they were investigating whether a sinking of a marine tanker in rough seas off their own coast on Thursday was related to the storm. Gaimi did not make landfall in the Philippines, but flooded the capital Manila and nearby towns the day before, with hundreds of homes still without power. Officials said at least 14 people there had died. Meanwhile, Gaimi is now barreling toward mainland China, where forecasters there say they expect a less intense storm, but heavy rain in many areas. State media reports authorities gave warnings for coastal provinces Fujian and Zhejiang, suspended train services, and relocated some 150,000 people.
Kenyan President William Ruto nominated 4 members of the main opposition party to cabinet on Wednesday, a move he promised in response to nationwide protests.
I have this to say to Kenyans. I have heard you, and I have heard you clearly.
The opposition members, including the pick to lead the finance ministry, are allies of opposition leader Raila Odinga, whom Ruto defeated in the 2022 election. In a speech, Ruto called the new government, quote, a visionary partnership for the radical transformation of Kenya, and said he would be proposing anti-corruption and whistleblower protection amendments. Besides the 4 opposition members, Ruto named 5 members of the cabinet he dismissed earlier this month in response to protesters' demands. But activists have criticized the new government as a corrupt bargain. The young protesters behind 6 weeks of protests that forced Ruto to withdraw $2.7 billion in tax hikes said the unity government would perpetuate a tradition of leaders co-opting the opposition at the expense of the population. The protests are the biggest crisis of Ruto's 2 years in power. More than 50 people have been killed, and demonstrations have continued even after the tax hikes were shelved. Many activists are now calling for Ruto's resignation and far-reaching reforms to tackle graft. Ruto initially praised the protesters for being peaceful and mobilizing across ethnic lines, but has stepped up criticism in recent days, saying they were causing, quote, mayhem and anarchy.
The Prime Minister of the State of Israel.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was met with standing ovations at his address to a joint session of the U.S. Congress on Wednesday, while outside, Capitol Police deployed pepper spray on protesters opposed to the visit by the foreign leader.
America and Israel must stand together.
Netanyahu described the U.S. and Israel as allies in a joint fight against the threat posed by Iran and its proxy forces across the Middle East. And he thanked U.S. President Joe Biden for his support of Israel following the October 7th attack by Hamas gunmen from the Gaza Strip.
And he came to Israel to stand with us during our darkest hour, a visit that will never be forgotten.
But 10 months after that attack, in which the Palestinian militants killed 1,200 people and took more than 200 hostages, fighting rages on in the Gaza Strip, where Palestinian health officials say Israel's retaliatory operation has so far killed more than 39,000. Dozens of U.S. lawmakers boycotted his speech. Democratic Representative Rashida Tlaib, who is Palestinian, sat in the gallery holding a sign declaring Netanyahu a war criminal. And the protests outside echo the pressure the Israeli leader faces at home. Israelis for months have been demanding he resign. Others are urging him to secure the release of more than 100 captives still believed held in Gaza. Ahead of his visit to Washington, families of the hostages pressed the prime minister to stay and work toward a potential ceasefire that would see their release. Netanyahu told U.S. lawmakers talks were underway at the moment that could lead to a breakthrough.
As we speak, we're actively engaged in intensive efforts to secure their release, and I'm confident that these efforts can succeed. Some of them are taking place right now.
And he also described his end game after fighting had concluded.
Gaza should have a civilian administration run by Palestinians who do not seek to destroy Israel. That's not too much to ask.
A senior Hamas official said Netanyahu's speech showed the prime minister did not intend to clinch a ceasefire deal. Netanyahu is scheduled to meet with Biden this trip, as well as with Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump.
He was a popular and well-known teacher, but he was also a pedophile. Unfortunately, there were other little girls that he also abused in care.
Moapulu Francis Tangaloa was repeatedly abused from the age of 5 to 7 by a Catholic brother. And a landmark New Zealand report shows she is not alone. It revealed that around 200,000 children and vulnerable adults were abused while in state and church care over the last 70 years. That's nearly 1 in 3 of those who passed through the system.
I'm gonna make it shine.
On Wednesday, people who suffered this abuse marched to Parliament ahead of the report being addressed, branding this a historic moment. The findings follow a national investigation into the experiences of over 2,300 survivors of abuse between 1950 and 2019. Survivors were subjected to abuse, torture, rape, sterilisation and electric shocks in state and church care. Tangaloa was one of the people to testify.
I didn't remember my abuse until I was an adult and started getting flashbacks. And that was very traumatic, like experiencing that trauma. So I had to work through that. The commission comes around and then I decide, well, this is what I need. I need to tell my story. I need them to know what my story was. So that's how I got involved. It was challenging being involved with the commission because having to tell the detail of your abuse is just re-traumatizing for any survivor. But I knew I needed to tell my story.
The report, sitting at over 3,000 pages, marks one of the longest and most extensive in the country's history. It was tabled on Wednesday in Parliament, while survivors and supporters filled the gallery. It contained 138 recommendations, including a transformation of the care system, as well as calls for public apologies from the heads of the Anglican and Catholic churches and the government. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon.
A terrible injustice was done in the name of state care, and it is now the responsibility of the state to make redress, and this government will ensure that it happens. As difficult as it is, I hope that all New Zealanders take the time to read this report, to understand the abuse that you, the survivors, suffered and the lifelong impact it had on your lives.
The report found those from the Indigenous Maori community were especially vulnerable to abuse, as well as those with mental or physical disabilities. For Tony Jarvis, it represented acknowledgement.
For decades they told us we made it up. They wouldn't have a bar of us. So this today is historic, and that's acknowledgement. It acknowledges all these people here, all the courageous survivors that have been courageous and strong enough to share their stories and come on board. You know, this is their story. It's not just mine and Castor to stand here speaking to. It's their story. All these people around here, the ones that are home, our passed away one, family and whānau that are not here.
Two of Europe's biggest banks beat forecasts on Wednesday, but still managed to upset investors. Deutsche Bank posted a smaller than expected loss, but it set aside around $1.4 billion for an investor lawsuit, with the move scuppering plans for a share buyback. That saw shares in the bank tumble 7% in early trades. The loss also ended a streak of 15 profitable quarters. But Chief Executive Christian Sewing was unworried. In a note to staff, he said the loss was solely due to the legal provision and the bank was on track to hit its goals. France's BNP Paribas also beat forecasts. The Eurozone's biggest bank saw net income jump by over a fifth to nearly $3.7 billion. That marked its best ever second quarter. But there too, shares fell from the open, dropping around 2%. Investors were dismayed by a big drop in net interest income, the difference between what the bank earns on loans and what it pays on deposits. One analyst said the numbers suggest a poor performance for the lender's retail operations in France and elsewhere.